This is a new ministry which is just starting. Reverend Hood needs your help in sharing the good news of Jesus Christ and His power throughout the world. If you would be so kind as to send a donation to Nicholas Hood III Ministries of any amount, Reverend Hood will send you a free complimentary copy of his book of original personal prayers and beautiful photographs entitled The Test, The Strength, The Endurance, and The Way Out. We appreciate your support, and in this way, you can partner with Reverend Hood in sharing the good news of Jesus throughout the world. Please make your check out to Nicholas Hood III Ministries and mail it to 4535 Chrysler Drive, Detroit, Michigan, 48201. Welcome to Nicholas Hood III Ministries, a ministry of hope, spiritual inspiration, personal power guided by Christian love. May the power of God's Holy Spirit fall upon you as you sit back and enjoy today's program. I introduce you now to Pastor Nicholas Hood III.
Today I begin a three-part series on the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah has always fascinated me because he's a fellow who is described as the cupbearer to the king. And the king that he's cupbearer to is not the king of Jerusalem. It's not the king of Assyria. It's not the king of Babylon. But he is the cupbearer to the king of Persia. And at that time in history, in world history, Persia was the dominant country. And it's nothing like living in a dominant country. There was a time when, if you lived in Britain, it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Britain was powerful in its day, but also was Shaka Zulu in South Africa. He was powerful. Genghis Khan had a power unparalleled during his time. And now we have the United States of America. And it is such a blessing to live in America at such a time as this. We have the greatest economy the world has ever seen. We have the greatest military the world has ever seen. And we happen to be living at this time in this place. But Nehemiah describes himself as the cupbearer to the king. And what is a cupbearer? The cupbearer is the person who literally brings the liquid refreshment to the king. Whatever the king wants, the cupbearer provides it. If the king wants water, he brings water. If the king wants wine, he brings wine. If the king wants juice, he brings juice. Whatever the king wants, the cupbearer will bring it. And it seems like in the modern times that we don't have many cupbearers, but if you live and thrive at a certain level, there may be a cupbearer. I saw one in 1993. I was part of a group of ministers who helped to bring Bill Clinton to Cobo Hall. And when Bill Clinton came, as we were lined up to go in to the dais, there was a young man who stood at attention, and he had a tray, and he had a cup of orange juice in his hand. And, you know, nothing like being a black preacher. One of my preacher friends looked at me, he kind of elbowed me, said, "Look, cupbearer. This is the cupbearer." And we had a good laugh about that. But at the end of the first chapter of the book of Nehemiah, it concludes itself, I believe it's verse 11. It concludes by simply saying, "I was cupbearer to the king." And let me share with you what Nehemiah is talking about before he describes himself as the cupbearer. He describes himself as being incredibly sad because word has come to him that the Jewish people are suffering in Jerusalem. Word has come to him that the walls of Jerusalem have been torn down. And because the walls are torn down, the people who lived in the city were defenseless. And so, as cupbearer to the king, Nehemiah had access that was unparalleled. Nehemiah had an opportunity to be on a first name basis with the king of Persia. And it is in that position where Nehemiah begins to pray to God, that God would give him the right words, that God would give him the right spirit, that God would pierce the heart of the king of Persia, and that the king of Persia would grant him permission to return home to Jerusalem to repair the walls. And so Nehemiah goes for several days. The Bible says that his countenance was sad. The Bible tells us that he couldn't figure out the right words to begin his speech. And before he can start a speech, the king preempts him and says, Nehemiah, why do you have such a sad face? What is bothering you? Have I done anything to you? Has somebody else done something to you? And with that urging, Nehemiah then looks at the king and he says, I'm sad because my homeland is in distress. I'm sad because the walls of Jerusalem have been torn down. And what I would like, King, is for you to give me permission to return to Jerusalem. Give me an opportunity to go home. Give me an opportunity to survey the walls, and give me an opportunity to fix the breaches, the gaps in the wall. And I don't know if it was to his surprise, but number one, the king said, sure, you can go home. You know, sometimes in life, we don't receive because we simply don't ask. In James chapter 4, in the New Testament, James says, you have not because you ask not. And think about the times in your life when you haven't received a blessing because you simply kept your mouth shut. You know, and James tells us, sometimes you don't have because you just didn't ask. In the case of Nehemiah, he asked. And so think about what happens. Number one, the king says, certainly you can go home. Number two, I will give you a handwritten letter of introduction for any country that you have to pass through, from Persia to get to Jerusalem. And number three, I'm going to give you an armed guard. I'm going to give you two military units. One will be foot soldiers. The other one will be a cavalry. And the combination of this letter of introduction, the combination of the letter of introduction and having a military escort should allow you safe passage. And then the king looked at him and he said, how long do you think it will take? And frankly, Nehemiah really didn't know. But the king gives him his blessing. And as Nehemiah begins to make preparations to return to Jerusalem, he ends the first chapter by simply saying, I was cupbearer to the king. And I have pondered this verse for some time. And what this verse has caused me to wonder is, why does Nehemiah conclude the first chapter by saying, I was cupbearer to the king? Is he saying, I was cupbearer to the king in a spirit of being braggadocious? Is he saying, I was cupbearer to the king because he wanted to make sure that other people knew that he was a big shot? Is he saying, I was cupbearer to the king because he's participating in what some people call reflective glory? And think about reflective glory. Reflective glory is when you're not the king, when you're not the big shot, but you just want a photobomb. You want to get in the picture with somebody who's a big shot. And then you want other people to think maybe you're a big shot because you simply got in a photo with a big shot. But the big shot really doesn't know your name. The big shot is not thinking about you, other than the big shot knows that if they take a cell phone picture with you, it's going to end up on your page. You know, I was with some people who were trying to find photos for a family tribute and for the person that they are lauding. And they said, well, We've got a picture here with Spike Lee. We've got a picture over here with Anderson Cooper. We've got, some other, notables that the person we want to honor has been with. And so let's put all those photos together, and basically it will convey that our relative has rubbed shoulders with some big shots. And so I don't know if Nehemiah is trying to elevate himself, or if he's just saying matter-of-factly, I was cupbearer to the king. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to interview a great psychiatrist from Detroit, Dr. Linda Hotchkiss. And when we talk, I'm going to ask her about this point. What do you think was going on in the head of Nehemiah when he said, I was cupbearer to the king? Do you think he was really trying to project himself in a kind of, reactive, relative sense of glory? Or do you think he's just saying this matter-of-factly? And when in life are we, like Nehemiah, willing to put our great position, to put our title, to put our money, to put our reputation on the line, to go home to a place like Jerusalem that's in disrepair? And, I can identify with Nehemiah, because Nehemiah could have lived out his days in Persia simply bearing the cup for the king. But rather than live out his days in peace and relative wealth, Nehemiah puts it all on the line. And he says, I want to go home. I can't live a good life. I can't be the man that I want to be. I can't feel good about myself if I'm living high on the hog in Persia, but the people of Jerusalem are messed up. And so I am willing to just chuck it all to the wind, to go home and to repair the breaches in the walls of Jerusalem. And even though I am a cupbearer for the king, and I tell you, in my life, I can identify with Nehemiah because I've done a few things in my life that are pretty good. There are a few people who seem to know who I am, but I tell you, at the end of the day, all I am is a cupbearer for the king. And let me tell you about the king I'm a cupbearer for. I'm not a cupbearer to the king of Persia. I'm not a cupbearer to the president of the United States, but all I am is a cupbearer for Jesus Christ. All I do is every week I get on in front of a microphone in a pulpit and I preach the good news of Jesus Christ. I preach salvation and redemption in Jesus Christ. I tell anybody who will listen that Jesus Christ has made a difference in my life and that he can make a difference in your life. And just as the walls of Jerusalem were torn down in the time of Nehemiah, some of us are living lives that are torn down. And all I'm here to say is that the Lord can put your life back together. You think your life is a mess. You think you are a failure. You think that you are a mess up. But Jesus Christ will take your mess, wash you clean, not just on the outside, but on the inside, and will take your life to a whole other place. My friends, in a few minutes, stick around. And when I come back, I'm going to talk with Dr. Linda Hotchkiss about being a cupbearer for the king.
This is a new ministry which is just starting. Reverend Hood needs your help in sharing the good news of Jesus Christ and his power throughout the world. If you would be so kind as to send a donation to Nicholas Hood III Ministries of any amount, Reverend Hood will send you a free complimentary copy of his book of original personal prayers and beautiful photographs entitled The Test, The Strength, The Endurance, and The Way Out. We appreciate your support, and in this way, you can partner with Reverend Hood in sharing the good news of Jesus throughout the world. Please make your check out to Nicholas Hood III Ministries and mail it to 4535 Chrysler Drive, Detroit, Michigan, 48201.
Hi, I'm Nick Hood and pastor of Plymouth United Church of Christ in Detroit. And I want to introduce you today to Dr. Linda Hotchkiss, who's a noted, great psychiatrist. She's also a member of the church that I pastor. But I've asked Dr. Hotchkiss to join me today to talk about Nehemiah from the perspective of being emotionally healthy. And where I left off in my little sermonette at the beginning of this hour is that Nehemiah self-describes himself as a cupbearer to the king. And what are your thoughts about this? What does that tell you about the emotional wellness of Nehemiah?
I think it tells me a lot about Nehemiah's strength. Here is a man who's been a prisoner of war, and then he became a servant. He's part of a conquered people, became a servant, and then he became a trusted friend to the king, and then a trusted lieutenant. The cupbearer, as you were talking about, that cupbearer does bring liquid refreshment to the king. He could poison him at any time, but he's a trusted servant, then a trusted lieutenant. And that tells me that Nehemiah is somebody who has a lot of strength in terms of being able to be adaptable. Tells me that he's very healthy from an emotional point of view. He is able to adapt to very, very different situations. And in this particular case, he's letting us know, too, that you can be anybody. It doesn't matter what your station has been. You can be anybody and still become a trusted servant, trusted lieutenant, trusted friend to a king.
So we learn from this story that Nehemiah is a trusted friend of the king, but then he's willing to risk it all by asking the king to let him have safe passage to go back to Jerusalem, to repair the walls. What does that tell you about Nehemiah?
Well, it tells me a couple of things. One, it tells me that his heart is still with his people. It tells me that he is worried about others beyond himself. Most of all, it tells me he has courage. He has a lot of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, because when I read that, I thought, why would this guy want to leave the safety, of the palace and go to where it's dangerous? He knows it's dangerous. That takes a lot of courage. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the ability to move towards something that you feel is greater than your fear. And I think we see that in Nehemiah.
Dr. Hotchkiss, sitting on the outside looking through the mirror of time at other people, and maybe even looking at the mirror of ourselves, how do we determine when a person is emotionally healthy? I mean, and do you think that Nehemiah demonstrates an emotional wellness?
I do. And, different people define emotionally healthy in different ways, so bear that in mind. But I think when a person is able to adapt to very stressful situations, when they're able to handle life's challenges, when they know who to ask for help and they know when to ask for help. So many people get into very tough situations, myself included, by not knowing when to ask for help or not feeling comfortable asking for help. So that is an important element in emotional wellness. In Nehemiah's case, he knows who to ask for help. He asks God, he prays, and he asks the king. I think those things are important. I think the other thing that indicates emotional health is saying no when you need to say no for your own health or for your own safety, and without feeling guilty. And that's hard. That's hard for a lot of people. And then lastly, people who are emotionally healthy usually have a very strong support network. They're either family, friends, pastor. They have a strong support network that helps them maintain their emotional health.
Every week I receive calls from people all over the country to this show. We've got a toll-free number. And many of the people who call are calling for prayer. But one of the reasons why I've invited you and several other guests who've been on this program is that you are a licensed, a trained, a certified medical professional. And you have a specialty in psychiatry. And could you explain for our audience what's the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist?
A psychiatrist goes to medical school. So I went through anatomy, physiology, went through working in hospitals, went through learning how to do operations. We go through medical school. We also do a lot of pharmacology, which lets us learn how to practice pharmacology in a way where we can prescribe medications safely. So the primary difference is going through medical school and being able to not only talk with people about learning how to identify and managing their emotions and their stress, but using medications and other kinds of interventions when needed.
Yeah, well, it would be interesting to know if Nehemiah sought psychological help before volunteering himself to go back to Jerusalem. But if somebody's looking at this program today, how can they figure out, if you're not a medical professional, how do you figure out when it's time to see a psychologist as opposed to a psychiatrist? And as a layperson, how do we know?
I think you really can look at it a little bit differently. I think you need to seek out a mental health professional whenever, and it could be a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a mental health worker at an emergency room in a hospital. If we're talking about you feeling like you want to hurt yourself or harm someone else, I think that's the most important thing. Seek out a mental health professional there. When people are depressed, they sometimes have overwhelming sadness, they lack an interest in activities, they isolate themselves more, and when they become very, very depressed, I think they may get to a point where they will need both psychotherapy, someone to talk to, as well as medications. There are now medications that make all the difference in the world in terms of depression. Similarly, if someone is hearing voices or seeing visions detached completely from reality, psychotic, again, they probably are going to need both therapy as well as medication. So at the kind of extreme ends of symptoms, I think that's when you start thinking maybe psychiatrist, because maybe medication might be necessary. The other time when you think maybe a psychiatrist, because we're also medically trained, you want to make sure there isn't something else physiologically going on with the person. Somebody who has too much thyroid, hyperthyroidism, they can look just like somebody who's manic. Someone who has too little thyroid, hypothyroidism, they can look just like somebody who's depressed. So you also want to be able to integrate into that what else is going on, not only in the mind, but the body.
Dr. Hodges, we only have about a minute left, but tell me, how has your faith been impacted by being a medical professional?
You know, professionally, I always ask the person that I'm talking to, have you talked to your pastor, your spiritual leader? Because I want them to feel comfortable being able to tell me whether they have or haven't, whether they believe or don't believe. From a personal point of view, when I'm working with somebody really difficult, that's when I pray the most. So that's how it helps me.
Yeah. I was telling an electrician just yesterday, a guy doing some work at my house, about times when I've counseled people who were threatening to commit suicide. And there was a lady, we were talking about this because there was a lady at the Jeffersonian apartment building right behind my house who she jumped.
Oh, she did.
But all day long she was threatening to jump off a balcony. And that can cause you to pray if you're trying to, preserve life. I want to thank you so much for being with me today, and to our audience, I just want to say that Dr. Linda Hotchkiss is going to be with me for the next 3 weeks, and we're going to be examining the psychological makeup of Nehemiah, but really the lessons we can learn from Nehemiah. And next week, you can get your Bible out now, thumb to chapter 2. Next week, we're going to look at the process that Nehemiah underwent to survey the walls of Jerusalem. And in particular, Dr. Hotchkiss, I want to talk about what were the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats that Nehemiah observed, and what we can learn about that in our lives. But thanks again for being with me today.
Thank you.
And I look forward to talking with you next week, a little bit more about Nehemiah.
Thanks.
Folks, thanks so much for tuning in. And remember, I am praying for you.
This is a new ministry which is just starting. Reverend Hood needs your help in sharing the good news of Jesus Christ and his power throughout the world. If you would be so kind as to send a donation to Nicholas Hood III Ministries of any amount, Reverend Hood will send you a free complimentary copy of his book of original personal prayers and beautiful photographs. If this broadcast has been a blessing to you, we ask that you mail a tax-free donation to Nicholas Hood Ministries at 4535 Chrysler Drive, Detroit, Michigan, 48201.